Hi, this is Anjali Primlani, and I am with Speculative Literature Foundation, and I am speaking today with Richard Chwedyk. He is the adjunct professor of instruction from in the English and Creative Writing Department at Columbia College Chicago.
Yeah, that's a mouthful.
Yeah. And he's a very well-established writer in science fiction and fantasy. His novella Bronte's Egg won the Nebula in 1970?
2002. Not quite that old.
I was about to say.
1970 would be about 53, 54 years ago.
Right, a long, long time ago.
I would have been a lad, yes.
Yeah.
Without getting any more specific than that.
And he's written short stories and novels and novelettes, and he's worked with some of the great editors in this business. And I wanted to start with a quote that you had in the Bulletin of Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, in an interview they did with you, in which you basically said you may be one of the worst teachers of science fiction and fantasy.
Yes, I said that. And I may be right. I don't know. There are many terrible teachers. And I may just be in the runners-up, or maybe the runners down, I'm only the 8th worst teacher of science fiction writing. But I think one of the reasons that I said that is that, especially in literary and creative writing classes, there is an insecurity that a lot of teachers have about not being an authority, and well, I'm here, I'm sitting in front of this class, somebody has paid me money to do this, and therefore I must be an authority, I must come off as an authority, I must know what I'm talking about. And over the years, through my experience writing science fiction, I thought, no, you don't have to know what you're talking about. Not only that, but my undergraduate degree was very closely into creative writing. And with the exception of a small number of teachers, I knew that a lot of the folks teaching creative writing, they may have known something about writing, but that did not translate into knowing anything about teaching. And so I took the pressure off of myself, and I said, I know absolutely nothing, and I have no authority whatsoever. But that's not important. What's important is the students are sitting here, and they say, we want a class in science fiction. And my job is to say, okay, what do you want in science fiction? And they'll tell me. And they'll tell me in no uncertain terms. They'll tell me rockets, ray guns, and robots, the 3 R's that we were speaking about before, or whatever it happens to be. They'll have some sort of model. They'll have some sort of book, which is their signature, Frank Herbert, Arthur C. Clarke. More recently, they want to be the next John Scalzi. Don't ask me why, but, you could do worse. You're going to be the next Ursula Le Guin, bravo, but they'll have some idea of what they want to do. And so it's like, okay, here's boil down to some essentials. Here's what those folks are doing. However, have you considered doing this? Have you considered doing this? Or have you considered doing some other thing, which isn't necessarily within the frame of what they think of as science fiction, but certainly could fit into that as well. It's not sitting there and saying, so and so wrote this, and they did it because they were trying to do this, this, and this. One of my mentors whom I never got to meet, people who were mentors simply by reading their work, was Alfred Bester. And Alfred Bester, confessed in one of the introductions to one of his stories in a short story collection, that the act of writing is in some ways a kind of madness. And you do whatever you do to get the story together. You know what constitutes a story. That's where I jump in and I say, here are 5 elements that you will find in almost every short story, no matter how strange and odd it is. And we'll look at some and we'll look at how they may come together. But the other thing is that within that process, there is a moment where you don't have the slightest idea of how this is going to work. But then you finish the story, you send it off, somebody says it's good enough, and suddenly you're getting a check in the mail or a Venmo or a little thing from Payback saying you have received money, and you think, how the heck did I do that? Mm-hmm. And you make up a story about how you came up with the story. It's mostly invented, but it'll do. Not only that, but if you have to write an introduction, or if somebody asks you to write how to write real good, you can tell them this is what you do. But the actual creative process is something akin to a kind of madness, and you never know. If I can use an example, if I'm not talking too long on one subject. And I'll bring this up because Bronte's Egg is the story that won the Nebula. I had first written it was a short story that turned into eventually a novelette. It went into novelette territory by a few hundred words. It was called The Measure of All Things. And I worked very carefully on that story, and I worked painstakingly on what would, a reader, especially a reader in a science fiction magazine, accept on the whole notion of bioengineered dinosaurs that were designed to be toys. They were marketed and sold as toys, and they had their popular moment on the market the way that a lot of manufacturers have, there's a crazed toy one Christmas and that. There may have been a few years where the bioengineered dinosaurs were the biggest thing. And then everybody moved on to whatever was the next big trend. So that these dinosaurs, even though they're bioengineered and they were told, well, they're not really alive, and they have intellectual limitations, and they have lifespan limitations. They have all the stuff that's built in so that you can think of them as being disposable after 3 years. And then 3 years come and they're not disposable. And some of them are still alive.
Wait. Let's go back to, you were talking about the 5 elements that should be in every short story.
The 5 elements of the short story?
Yes, tell me the 5 elements.
Well, there should be a central character. There should be what we would consider a protagonist. There are all sorts of other terms, but there would be who the story is about. That's it. You think, oh, that's simple enough, but it's not always simple enough. The second thing is they need a context, which again gets included as setting. And I've had science fiction writers and teachers say, that's what makes science fiction different, is setting. The setting is different. It's a different place. It's like, okay, that's important. And the third thing is that, as Kurt Vonnegut would point out, people need to do something. It's the motivation. It's the, where the character is going, what the character needs to do. And fourth, it's the thing that's keeping the character from doing whatever the character wants to do. That can be, some people object to using the word conflict, because conflict sounds like it's always got to be boom, 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 punch her out. Conflict, unless you use it in the widest sense, is somewhat limiting. There are all sorts of things that can provide conflict. And then the end, again, writing teachers will get mad if you say resolution. Why does it have to resolve? And it's like, it depends on what you mean by resolution. That's why I have switched over and used the term outcome. What is the outcome? Force A meets force B. Kablooey ensues, and there is an outcome, which is either scattered parts over here, scattered parts over there, or there is a fusion of two things that comes together. There are a number of different ways that this will work out. When fast-moving train meets brick wall, or any other way you want to see what's going on in the story, and that is important whether or not you're writing a science fiction story. But very often in science fiction stories, there is an added element to it, because it may be the whole reason of existence for the short story, is to show this is how things work out. That outcome very often will prove will prove any sort of implied point to the story. Don't go there. Don't do that. Bad thing. Don't get involved with fascists. Bad idea. Do get involved with this, but not in such and such way. And that's very strong, to the point of in science fiction. And one of the neat things about science fiction is that that's a brand. I use the B word here, where that kind of story writing is still recognized and allowable. Whereas in a lot of literary areas, they try to file off the sharp edges of that kind of thing and say, well, you don't have to have this kind of an outcome, or you can imply the outcome. All fine and good. But in science fiction, you can write a story that sort of says, Joe B., whoever he happens to be, wanted to do this, which has implications, either good or not good, or both. And boom, that's the end of the story. Somebody will say, oh, that's not very subtle, and oh, that's very basic storytelling. And it's like, okay, what's wrong with basic storytelling? One of the things, one of the things not mentioned in my bio is that I do have a master's in English from Northwestern University. I have to have it registered because it's a deadly weapon. If you wield this thing, you can cause trouble. But one of the things in studying literature, especially since I had to study modern, postmodern literature from the 20th century, was that a number of authors did everything they possibly could do to kill the idea of story, to make it irrelevant. focus more on this, but we really don't need a story because a story is very simple and facile, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what's been happening in the 21st century is that we're rediscovering how important stories are to us. And that may explain, it overlaps into the 20th century, but the importance of authors like J.R.R. Tolkien, whom, before I had to teach a Tolkien class, I never would have been able to tell you that. Because, I had the Tolkien class sprung upon me because the able professor who taught Tolkien for many years at Columbia was a Hobbit. She did not believe in any technology whatsoever. Everything was in paper and all of that. But she met me and she had had some discussions with me. And when she finally said, "I'm not dealing with COVID anymore, and I'm going to retire to my home and write a book about teaching Tolkien." I said, "Ooh, that sounds like a good idea. Why don't you take over?" And I said, "I haven't read Tolkien since Ronald Reagan was president." So I had to rediscover Tolkien. I may be the worst Tolkien instructor in the world, along with being the worst science fiction teacher.
Now, how does teaching Tolkien impact how you talk about science fiction and fantasy in general?
Well, that's a very interesting thing. I've been doing some introductions for Arc Manor Media, Shahid's publishing concern, and he has been reissuing a number of books. And I've written intros for a couple Robert Heinlein books and a couple Daniel Galloway books, and one of Christopher Stasheff's books, The Warlock in Spite of Himself. But then just recently, he asked me to write an introduction for Cordwainer Smith's only novel as Cordwainer Smith, the Norstrilia. And in reading Norstrilia again, after teaching Tolkien for X number of years, I suddenly said, there's something very similar about Cordwainer Smith and J.R.R. Tolkien. Part of which is that they are both fascinated by language. Not only that, but they're both fascinated with poetry. You can't get 2 pages through Lord of the Rings without somebody breaking into song or into legend, something like that. And as you read Norstrilia, you find that the same thing is happening. A number of tales that become part of the narrative in Norstrilia are summarized, in little songs or poems or ditties that somebody knows that Smith wants to recount, and in some ways it reflects a love of language and the importance of language in the telling of stories. And suddenly I said, I never would have thought I'd be comparing Cordwainer Smith and J.R.R. Tolkien, but there you are. Another aspect of it is that to both of them, the stories themselves are important. Scholars get caught up in the origins of this myth or this character, or that such and such place in Tolkien's novel is actually also the name of a street in some village in the English Midlands, and the word comes from something that means the opposite of what and they just go on and on and on about that, and all of that is there. It's really there, but at the heart of it, Tolkien wants to tell you a story that, power is defeated, not necessarily by big heroes, but often by small, in this case, physically small people, and may be the product of chance, of happenstance, or fate. They may be two sides of the same coin. And there's a lot of that which is at the heart of Cordwainer Smith's, not just Australia, but a lot of his very good short fiction. I suddenly said, I'm going to get in trouble with two camps because I know a couple people who have become Cordwainer Smith specialists, and they've read everything they could find, from Cordwainer Smith and interviewed everybody who was still alive, and they know every little thing about Cordwainer Smith. And of course, there is a whole industry of Tolkien scholarship, throughout the world. But there's also the Tolkien. There's archives up in Wisconsin. Just there are all these folks. I certainly said, oh, Tolkien and Cordwainer Smith. They're sort of barking up the same tree, and doing it in similar ways. And it's like, this is an outrage. Sir, I must ask you to step outside. How dare you, try to confine what Smith is doing and what Tolkien's doing. And it's like, I know it seems like a real stretch. And I never would have done it except for the fact that I was a big Cordwainer Smith fan when I started becoming a grown-up reading science fiction writing. But in this introduction, I said, if you look at the body of Cordwainer Smith short fiction, the stuff that Paul Myron Anthony Linebarger wrote as Cordwainer Smith, as the Silmarillion, then Norstrilia becomes the Lord of the Rings. And at this point, somebody tosses the gauntlet down and says, "Sir, I will meet you for pistols at dawn. How dare you say this?"
So let's talk a little bit about these lines between the genres. Obviously, this is a thing people feel very strongly about, but how do you feel about it?
The lines between the genres is this is something which is very, very important, especially to scholars. Scholars love to figure out where one line, the property ends over here. They're sort of like surveyors. It's like, okay, once you get to here, you're in science fiction. But if you step over here, boom, you're on somebody else's turf. And part of that has to do with, to be fair to scholars, comprehending the subject. Okay, granted. But there's a certain point where it also becomes just an issue of turf. And it's as if, I have to decide, here's science fiction, here's where we put the fence, no trespassing. And those lines become very important. They also become very important if you have defined a science fiction purely as a popular form. This is work that appeared in pulpy dime magazines. It's not of any great importance. Its place of publication defines it as a lower art form. Therefore, if you have another author, most recently, and I'm going to blank on names because I'm an old man and I blank on names a lot. But like Tochi Onyebuchi, whose most recent book is sort of a combination of science fiction and gentrification, where The rich and the privileged are able to head out into space, but they want to pick the Earth for all the good stuff that's there. You know, it's sort of like in the thing that we understand in Chicago, we love to tear down buildings, but then people will buy hunks of the facade, of the terracotta, that they will then put into their own house. And it's like, oh, isn't that beautiful? Isn't that neat that you've preserved that? And I look at it as sort of saying, it's sort of like, you know, displaying the skulls of your enemies. You know, here's the head of the old Garrick Theater, you know, and we pulled it off, and don't that look cool? And it's like, yeah, with the Garrick Theater, where that was over on Randall, it's like a parking lot now. Or actually, they finally tore down the parking lot and they put up some other building in that. And if you stare at that and you sort of say, you know, Louis Sullivan built one of the greatest theaters in the world, and everybody's looking at you like, oh, you're crazy. Yeah, I have gone off my point, which I very often do. But it's because, you know, to some degree, I don't want to worry about the strict definitions of what, you know, because I forget, there's a fellow who lives out in Connecticut, whose name I won't mention, but when I mentioned it to my colleague, the late Phyllis Eisenstein, and she said, oh, I know who he is. He's that guy who hates everything. And he found out that Onibuchi lives in Connecticut and was considered, you know, a Connecticut writer, but also a science fiction writer. And the whole notion of the way that the gentrification, you know, between space and Earth is depicted was just so unscience fictional in that. It just showed, no, this isn't the real stuff. You know, it's like, oh, you mean the real stuff, you know, it was like the 1930s science fiction stories where you had a ship that was 4 miles long because that was the only way you could fit these 500-foot tall vacuum tubes into it. And it's like, you know, so that conception then is more, you know, realistic and practical, you know, than what a contemporary author, you know, would be doing with a science fictional topic. These days, but it's like, no, they're not, you know, they didn't go to the right school, they didn't learn science fiction, they didn't spend enough time drinking bad beer at a WorldCon, therefore they can't write science fiction.
Sorry. Yeah.
And so it's like, whoa, we're not letting you into the club. Mm-hmm. And I said, I didn't know you had to fill out an application. And sometimes I encounter that. And again, that's probably one of the reasons why I'm the worst science fiction writer, because I don't have the credentials. You know, I have been told, mostly by much older people, that you know, there should be, you know, don't worry about, you know, having science fiction writing courses at college. Everybody should go to Clarion. And it's like, well, not everybody goes to Clarion. Not only that, but not everybody who goes to Clarion turns into a published science fiction writer, or a fantasy writer for that matter. You know, there is no one doorway into science fiction. Trying to police that, I mean, that's been one of my favorite things in the fantasy writing workshop, and probably it goes back to science fiction writing workshop. You know, somebody says, "Oh, you know, you can't do that," or somebody, you know, I had another teacher, and he told me, "You can't do that in a short story," and I said, "How are they going to stop you? Is there a literature police? Do they hand out uniforms and badges, you know, to people, you know, and they give them billy clubs and they break in, and it's like, you know, you had two central protagonists in this story and you gave them exactly the same motivation. Get into the wagon, you know, and they'll drag you away." And it's like, you know, the only proof that story is going to, you know, is going to work is that you read it and you suddenly say, wow, that's a good story. You know, and I never would have thought in a million years you could do that in a short story. Boom, you do it. And then suddenly it's like, oh yeah, well, it's been common practice in fiction now for a long time. And it's like, no, it hasn't. Somebody will try something, and they'll say, oh, that's odd. That's just an eccentric author doing such and such thing. And then the next thing you know, the eccentric author is like Franz Kafka. And it's like, you've written In the Penal Colony. It's like, oh, that sounds like a dystopian story. So, oh, no, it's not dystopian and all that. And it's like, it looks pretty dystopian to me. And I've had discussions with students in the fantasy writing class, because I will now ask them, all right, what makes it a fantasy story? Because there are all sorts of experts who will say, fantasy stories occur in a secondary world, and there has to, and if there is a character who is from the primary world, there has to be a portal. And there has to be a portal between the primary world and the secondary world. And it's like, no, there doesn't. And it's like, oh, there's all sorts of books where there isn't one. Or if it is, it's very, it's very cleverly disguised. I'll say that fantasy writing, what about this guy who writes a story about an office worker named Gregor, who wakes up one morning and turns out he's a dung beetle. And I say, oh, well, that's magical realism. I said, he's a dung beetle. That sounds pretty fantasy to me. It's like, well, you can call it magical realism, and that's all fine and well, but it is all in that container, which may be the entirety of fiction that we call fantasy. I loved when Gene Wolfe one time, he was down at the big conference in Florida. He was a guest. What is that again? The International Conference on the Fantastic and the Arts. And he said, fantasy is the only thing in the world that's bigger than the world, because it contains everything. And you say, yeah, does it contain science fiction? By golly, yes, it does. Does it contain realism? And it's like, yeah, because realism as a concept, since it is a created work in prose, even if it does not contain one jot of a fantastic, excuse me, of a fantastical element. There are no elves, no dragons, no rings of power, anything like that. And in some ways or another, it's still within a fantastic framework. It's just a subcategory of this much larger category, which is fantasy, which we also call fiction. And it's one of the reasons why the study of all of these aspects of fiction, of literature, of storytelling, of the making of stories, is important and should be studied, by the scholarships, by the scholars with a certain equanimity. Oh, it's popular, therefore, ooh, James Patterson, ooh, he's got cooties, we can't study him. It's like, there are millions of people who read him and they don't care about this. There's always some furor or furore, depending on what side of the Atlantic you're on, for pronouncing these things. Because there's now a volume about the letters of Ray Bradbury. And somebody at New York Times book review or somebody used this as an excuse to skewer Ray Bradbury as being an overrated and sentimental writer. My first response was, there are millions of people who are buying Ray Bradbury books, and they're not buying Ray Bradbury because it's it's assigned for a class. Some of them might be buying it, but not all of them. And it's like, well, because of Fahrenheit 451 and all that. And it's like, no, they're buying the October Country. They're buying the Martian Chronicles. They're buying R is for Rocket. They're buying all sorts of other Ray Bradbury books. And they're not buying them because they're required texts, because somebody has told them that this is important literature. They're buying them because they like reading these stories. And then does it become the job of the literary scholar to say, well, that's because you're stupid. You should be over here, and you should be reading these books. I have this list over here. It's like, Jorge Luis Borges said, you can get to all these books on your own time. If you're not interested in reading, if you're not interested in reading Shakespeare now, don't sweat it. Come back to it later, and then suddenly you say, wait a minute. Now I understand that this isn't just, hoked up drama about kings and queens. This is about a family that is splitting themselves up over, how we're going to dish out the fortune. And then suddenly, Shakespeare becomes comprehensible for a reader. And as much as, all of our favorite authors from the English tradition, are thought of as great artists. Most of them were also people who worked in popular forms. Shakespeare was writing for an audience. Chaucer was not necessarily writing for an audience, but he was writing for amusement, and he was writing his versions of a number of things that were well-known stories. And since we got into Tolkien already, Tolkien spent 30 years at least telling people he was writing the translation of Beowulf. How much of that is? But he was fascinated with Beowulf. And Beowulf is one of these stories which, it was written down after a period, probably since the story had been told for hundreds of years before then, and one written version of it existed. One copy, which almost burned up in a fire, in a person's private library. So that last copy of Beowulf may not have survived the 18th century. However, it was a story that had been popularly told in mead halls to an audience that was probably illiterate. And one of the reasons why they were being told the stories is that that's how they were going to know them. And why would they be sitting there listening to this guy in the mead hall talk about this big monster Grendel that comes into the king's king's hall and slays his people? And what was the fascination about that? There's a lot we don't know about medieval life, but we know what scared the shit out of them. And it was not just Grendel, but it was the idea of a Grendel. And again, this doesn't necessarily fit into Joseph Campbell's hero's journey and all of that. It sort of does, but Campbell is always sort of just filing the edges off of these things. But what's scary is that okay, we killed Grendel, killed the dragon. Cool, that's cool. There's Grendel's mother. Grendel's mother! It's like, well, first of all, it's like, Grendel had a mother? And it's like, well, if Grendel had a mother, are there other mothers out there? There may be all sorts of, Grendels. I mean, Grendel's grandmother, Grendel's cousins, Grendel's half-cousins. And so the idea that then Beowulf has to go back and deal with, the ancestry of this is to say there's more scary things out of it. We don't just slay the dragon when we slay the dragon. Even though Beowulf ends up doing that too in the end, and really slaying the dragon. Those stories are the kind of things that have informed our literature. Before there was Shakespeare, there were the plays that were put on in the towns, the mystery plays and the miracle plays, and the allegories like Everyman or the Second Shepherd's Play, and those were just put on by the townspeople, and the people around the town. They put on their own shows. Mickey Rooney predates Shakespeare. Come on, we've got a barn, let's put on a show. Hey, the priest over here, he knows how to write. We can put something together. And you're good at playing such and such things. Why don't you play the guy who doesn't want, and they work this all out. And that's as much a part of our heritage as Chaucer is, as Dryden is, as Alexander Pope is. Even though they are examples, verified examples of poetry becoming a whole new thing. They've grown out of this impulse we have to understand the world by trying to make a story out of it.
So,
next question.
Tell me a little bit about some of the great editors you've worked with. Editing is such an important part of the literary process.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. There are great editors, by golly. And you know what happens with great editors? Great editors very often are people who will leave you alone, and will let you get into all sorts of trouble. And go out on a limb. And then every now and then they'll come back and say, wait a minute, didn't you have, this character over here, Farnsworth or something like that? Farnsworth! I completely forgot about Farnsworth, but the great editors they'll almost trick you to go out on a limb. It's like, gee, is that ice? Is that thick enough that it'll hold me if I go out there? And the editor will say, I don't know. Why don't you give it a try? It's like, well, maybe I should throw a rock out there. I said, well, why don't you walk out there too? And so you step out. And and suddenly the ice starts cracking, and you start noticing, you hear this terrible sound, and the editor says, "Well, I guess maybe you shouldn't have gone out that far." But they'll have let you do that, and given you this moment where you see your entire life pass before your eyes, and then say, "That might make a good story too." As important, if not more important, than good editors are good copy editors. In getting a number of the source stories published at Fantasy and Science Fiction, I have been blessed with incredibly detailed and detail-minded copy editors. The last of the source stories that I finished that was published in FNSF, it's a thing called The Man Who Put the Bomb. And in there, I have described a game that the Soars, they're in this little rescue home, sort of Victorian styled, and it's always described as at the edge of a great megalopolis. Meaning that they're surrounded by woods, but they're, on the road to and from the city. But these Soars like to play this game that was originally called Hit 'em Hard, until Agnes thought that was, Agnes the Stegosaurus, the very prescriptive and demanding Stegosaurus, who's always telling people how they should live. And Agnes says that name is too violent. So the game is called Not So Hard. But it's, there's a floor, and you have checkers, 12 checkers pieces, red and black. And one person gets a turn to flick with a finger, boing, like that. Or if they have a tail, they can use their tail. Because they're soars. They're soaring creatures. They have tails. They feel sorry for humans who don't have tails, because how do you balance yourself? It's ridiculous. No wonder you have so much back trouble. And the other problem you humans have is that you're always walking on you're bipedal. You're not bipedal. Get down on all fours. Has a quadruped ever started a world war? No. Anyway, so there's a scene in there where Agnes gets into a game of not so hard with one of the human visitors. When I get the proofs back from the copy editor, she has figured out, all right, wait a minute, you have this character who had this next move and that, but then shouldn't the next move be from such and such? And I said, you know how to play this game. You know how to play not so hard better than I do, and I invented it. And it's like, why would anybody take so much time to work out that detail? But she did. And there was another little detail in this story. I'm trying to remember now, where she was keeping track of some other behavior, some other character in the story was doing such and such thing, and saying, and it seemed like, oh, that's inconsequential and all, and it passed me by completely, and I was like, you have read this story so carefully, you know this world almost better than I do. And when you have a copy editor like that, it was in I think it was in Bronte's Egg, where I had a character who was quoting Cicero, and the copy editor had looked up the real quotation and the real Roman author who had said this, and I'm blanking on it now, and it's like, oh God, I would have looked like such an idiot if that had just gone by that way, and it's like the copy editor saved my life. It saved me professionally from hanging my head in shame, every time somebody would, go through that section. Because the minute she said, isn't this quote from such as, I went and looked it up, and it's like, oh, she's right. I had just presumed, okay, everybody knows that this saying is from this person, and I was wrong, totally wrong. Copy editor caught it. And I was like, thank God for copy editors. There is a special place in heaven for copy editors, and they deserve it. And perhaps, the actual creator of the universe, whoever that may be, may also be a copy editor.
Well, thank you very, very much for your time. This is, again, this is a great privilege. Is there anything else you would want to say to our audience or our students?
I think one thing, since I was actually looking at the article that I had written about teaching science fiction, I said, I'm wrong on so many things, and since, I've been part of the science fiction community for a while, I will have people walk up to me, and say, you were wrong. Because that's, that's kind of what folks will do. It's like, no, you can't have that. Such as, that isn't going to work. But I think one thing that I still feel confident about is, at the beginning of that article, I said that the science fiction of today, in no way resembles the science fiction of yesterday. And the science fiction of tomorrow is not going to resemble the science fiction of today, because it is within the nature of, not some, the form itself dictates a kind of change and transition. And it's also one of the reasons why older science fiction readers are, they're outraged at what gets passed off as science fiction these days. It wasn't like this when I was a kid. And it's like there's a lot of things that are not like it was when you were a kid. And part of what you have to do in terms of reading science fiction, and it's one of the things that's difficult as well for editors, and nearly impossible for scholars. But we'll get into. I won't even touch that. But is that you have to be open to not necessarily what fits within the little box of science fiction. Here's the little, and we can put this in, and we can put this in, and we can put all these little things in here, and then you shake them around, and you've got science fiction. See, it sounds like science fiction. It's, Horton hears a who, and it sounds that way. So it must be science fiction, but it's like, did you try moving this stuff over here? No, don't ever touch that. No, never mix your carrots and your peas. Don't put them together because, it will cause nuclear devastation. Never mix your carrots and your peas. And corn, let's not even go there. Corn is the worst. Don't mix them up. Succotash is evil. But it's sort of like, no. Try this. And it's like, well, it's not science fiction, but it's a good story. Oh. And you've committed a sin because you've written a good story? Well, it didn't fit in the box. It's like, make a new box. There's plenty of room, and there's again, there's no literature police that's going to come in the middle of the night and carry you away. If you have put a dragon in a story that is ostensibly a science fiction story, I forget, it's Riko Aoki's newest book that was up for a lot of awards, but everybody put it into the fantasy category because there's a character in there who's dealing with demons and that. And
I remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's also about a starship captain who's running a donut shop. And I said, starship captain, donut shop, it's science fiction. So I put it in science fiction. Everyone's like, oh no, but there's these demons in here. And it's like, we don't know what the demons are. I mean, the way that a number of writers have written about demons and demiurges and demigods make them sound more like alien creatures. We don't know exactly where they come from. And it's like, well, yes, but there's no premise that these are actually from an interplanetary thing. It's like, we don't know. Just because we don't know doesn't mean that you can't define it as being part of a world that you otherwise want to claim as science fiction.
What was the name of the book?
Something from Another Star. Something's from Another Star. I would look it up on my phone, but I'm afraid I'll disturb the camera over here if I run into it.
I like you on the title. It's such a great book.
Like that's another, yeah. No, if anything, maybe Aoki should have come up with Light from Uncommon Stars or something like that.
That's what it is.
That's it, yes. Oh, thank heavens, my memory is not completely destroyed. But Light from Uncommon Stars, which is a wonderful book, wonderful book. And everyone said, oh, it's fantasy. And I said, no, it's science fiction. It's like, well, if it gets put into the wrong slot, is that going to ruin the world? Is that going to upset the balance of the universe? Is there, absolutely no way in hell that we can, think of this book as something not science fiction? Because there's so many science fictional aspects to the book and to the point of view from which it's written. And all right, that's the last thing I'm going to say is this. The smartest thing about, another definition of science fiction is it is not a genre. It is not a literary category. It is not the T word tropes. You know, I find my students 25, you heard the story in the fantasy writing class, you know. I find them, you know, for using tropes. Science fiction is a way of looking at the world. You can get two writers who will describe the same event. One will describe it like a science fiction writer, whether or not it contains one or more of those science fictional elements. And I've known, who is it? C.M. Kornbluth and Algis Budrus at times, I am sure, I've never heard them say this. Oh, Kornbluth passed away when I was far too young, but I never heard AJ say, you know, sometimes I like to write a science fiction story which is so absent of science fiction elements that no one recognizes it's a science fiction story, even though it is. And there are a couple like that. I think there's one of his called Nobody Bothers Gus, which is a science fiction story. But you could probably get it past the nose of a number of other fiction magazines, you know, and they would never have known. It's the way you look at the material that, in a sense, it helps define science fiction. But no definition of science fiction is actually going to sit for very long without being challenged, because that's our job. It's our job.
Thank you very much. That's
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I have no idea whether or not any of that makes any sense, or if it's editable or whatever.
Yes, thank you so much for your time. And just, is there something that you're working on now, or how can people reach you or find you on social?
They can reach me on Facebook or on Gmail. And now that the strike is over, they can get me at Columbia College. Our Chwedyk at colum.edu is now working again.
Great.
I have a blog, but I haven't posted a lot of stuff on the blog in a long time. But the blog is called Critinomicon. Because we had to come up with some sort of a name, and I figured there is nobody else, you know, I won't get into any trademark problems with Critinomicon.
No. All right, thanks again.